Picture the high desert at dawn. A place so quiet you can hear your own breath, so empty it feels like the sky swallowed everything alive. Now imagine buying 240 acres of that emptiness for just $25. Most folks would call it a mistake. Others might call it madness. But for a broke ranch hand named Scott Jones, that patch of worthless sand and sagebrush was the first thing in years that felt like hope. What he didn't know was that this land carried a secret that had been wandering the desert alone, a secret with bones showing, hooves cracked, and eyes that still held a spark of something refusing to die. When that starving horse staggered into Scott's camp at sunrise, it didn't just change the value of his land. It changed the entire trajectory of his life. And by the time the dust settled, this $25 gamble would expose a buried crime, ignite a courtroom battle, and build a legacy no one saw coming. If stories like this hit you straight in the chest the way they do for us, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more Western tales from WesTtalesas A Down, and share this with someone who loves a good heart-stirring journey. It helps the channel more than you think, and it lets us keep bringing you these real frontier-style stories. The auction hall in Burns, Oregon didn't look like the kind of place where a man's life could pivot. It was just a dusty community center with flickering lights, metal folding chairs, and the faint smell of stale coffee. But sometimes life-changing moments show up in the most unremarkable rooms. Scott Jones learned that the hard way, or maybe the lucky way, depending on how you look at it. Scott was 26, running on hope thinner than boot leather, and carrying the kind of exhaustion you only get from years of doing other people's ranch work. He'd spent nearly a decade drifting from job to job across Oregon, picking up shifts wherever someone needed a ranch hand who wouldn't complain. He wasn't a dreamer anymore. Dreams were luxuries for folks who didn't tease sleep in old bunkhouses or stretch a dollar until it cried. All he wanted was one thing: his own land. A place he could work with his own hands. A place where his father's voice wouldn't echo in the back of his mind, reminding him of everything that had fallen apart. The auctioneer rattled through property listings while Scott sat near the back, head lowered, trying not to think too much about how many miles his truck had left before it gave up on him. Ranchers in better boots and better financial shape bought up the first listings. Some with barns, some with good water access, most starting at numbers Scott couldn't even wrap his mind around. 12,000, 32,000, 58,000. Money that felt like a fairy tale. Then the auctioneer paused, cleared his throat, and shifted his tone. Lot 32, high desert property, southeast of Burns. No structures, no road access, no water rights. Extreme remote location. Minimum bid, $25. A laugh rolled through the room. One man joked, they should pay someone to take that land. Scott stared at the listing sheet. One line. Barely a description, no photo. Just coordinates and a warning that the county wanted it off their books. $25. Something tugged at him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the simple fact that he wanted to own something, anything that didn't belong to someone else. Before he even realized what he was doing, his hand lifted. The room went quiet. A few ranchers turned to get a look at the poor fool who'd just volunteered to buy a desert. 25 going once, going twice. The auctioneer glanced around, almost hoping someone else would bail Scott out. Sold. Just like that, with one raised hand and the last bit of bravery he had. Scott became the owner of 240 acres of nothingness. After the paperwork was scanned, he stepped outside into the crisp September air, holding a folded deed and exactly $18 to his name. The county clerk had warned him that the land was middle of nowhere rough, but Scott didn't care. Something inside him felt lighter. Whatever this land was, it was his. It didn't matter if everyone else laughed. He'd finally taken a step towards something. That night, he slept in his truck at a highway rest stop because he couldn't afford a motel. But the excitement kept him awake anyway. He studied the map until the paper softened under his fingertips, tracing the boundary lines again and again. His 240 acres sat between two ridges of volcanic rock, tucked inside a valley that most people probably didn't even know existed. Worthless land, maybe, but for a man who'd never owned anything bigger than a second-hand saddle, it felt like treasure. The next morning he headed out before sunrise. Miles of paved road turned to gravel. Gravel turned to dirt. Dirt turned into the suggestion of a path. He drove until the world looked more like the surface of Mars than Oregon. Red rock, jagged formations, endless sagebrush, and a silence so deep you could fall into it. His tires kicked dust into the wind, and once he passed a twisted juniper that looked like a D lived through every storm the desert had ever thrown. He reached the coordinates late in the afternoon. No fences, no signs, no footprints, not even a scrap of old timber to suggest anyone had ever tried to live here. Just the open desert rising and falling like a forgotten ocean. Scott stepped out of the truck. The air felt untouched, ancient. A hawk circled overhead, its cry the only sound for miles. He breathed in slowly, letting the emptiness settle into him. This was land nobody wanted, land everyone dismissed, land he had bought for less than a tank of gas.
But standing there, boots planted in the dust, Scott felt something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. As the sun dipped behind the rocky ridge, he set up camp, a small fire, a can of beans heated in its tin, a sleeping bag rolled out beside the truck. When night finally took over, it was complete. No city glow, no headlights, no phone signals. Just stars. Oceans of them. The Milky Way smeared across the sky like a river of light. Scott lay there staring up, thinking maybe life wasn't done surprising him. He drifted asleep to the rustle of sagebrush and the gentle hiss of wind. Some hours later, long before dawn, something woke him. A sound. Heavy. Slow. Not the skitter of a rabbit or the light tread of a coyote. Something larger. His hand moved toward his rifle by instinct. He sat up, heartbeat steady but alert. The sound came again. A dragging step. A faint grunt. Something struggling. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam swept across the desert floor, then froze. At the edge of the light stood a horse. Or what was left of one. The animal was little more than bones draped in hide, ribs outlined like a xylophone, coat caked in dried mud and dust so thick it hid its true color. Its head hung low, eyes sunken but still watching him. The horse swayed like it might collapse any second, too weak even to shy away from the sudden light. Scott rose slowly, instinct guiding him more than thought. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Easy." The horse didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there breathing ragged, labored breaths. Up close, the damage was worse. Overgrown hooves curled and cracked. Wounds on its legs from barbed wire or worse. A deep, infected gash across the shoulder. Hunger so severe the hip bones protruded like spear points. This horse was dying. But it hadn't crawled into a cave or sheltered somewhere alone. It had come here. It had come to him. Scott crouched and filled a metal pot from his water jug. The horse drank like it hadn't tasted water in days. Maybe weeks. Each swallow made its body tremble. Scott refilled the pot again, and again, until half his water was gone. When the horse finally lifted its head, its eyes locked onto him with something that stopped him cold. Intelligence. Desperation. A plea. "Where did you come from?" Scott whispered. There was nothing out here for miles. No ranches. No fences. No trails. And yet this animal had appeared on his land like a survivor crawling out of the grave. At that moment, Scott didn't care about the property. He didn't care about the cost. He didn't care that the desert wasn't supposed to give anything back. He only knew one thing. He wasn't letting this horse die out here. Come on, Champ, he said softly, naming him without thinking. We're getting you out of here. And just like that, the worthless $25 land had revealed its first secret. A secret that would unravel everything Scott thought he knew about this valley, and about himself. Getting a half-dead horse out of the desert wasn't something any manual prepared you for. Champ was too weak to load, too fragile to push, and too exhausted to walk far. But he trusted Scott. That mattered more than strength. The horse let Scott guide him to the truck, stumbling one step at a time, leaning into the young rancher whenever his legs wobbled. Scott dropped the tailgate, spread out a tarp, and fashioned a crude ramp of packed dirt and a rope lead that acted as both guide and support. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't safe, but in the middle of the high desert before sunrise, it was all he had. The stallion braced himself against the truck bed, partly stepping, partly collapsing onto the tarp. Scott tightened the rope, knotted it to keep Champ steady, and laid his jacket beneath the horse's head. Then he did what he'd done his whole working life. He improvised. The drive back toward Burns took 4 grueling hours. Scott kept the speed low so Champ wouldn't slide or fall. Every 15 minutes he stopped, checked the horse's breathing, offered more water, whispered encouragement. Champ never fought. He just watched him with eyes that said the battle was bigger than either of them, but he wasn't ready to quit yet. By the time Scott reached the veterinary clinic, the sun was up and exhaustion was sitting heavy on his shoulders. Dr. Ellen Ramos, a 50-something woman with hands steady as oak roots, met him at the back door. One look at Champ and she didn't bother with questions. "Get him inside," she ordered. Now. The clinic staff moved fast, even with the early hour. For lines, antiseptic, clean towels, sedation prep. Scott backed up as Dr. Ramos worked, but she waved him closer. "You brought him in. Stay with him." Her voice carried the kind of authority you don't argue with. Champ stood trembling under the fluorescent lights as Dr. Ramos inspected each wound with practiced, clinical calm. "Severe dehydration," she muttered. "Malnutrition. Overgrown hooves, infected laceration on the shoulder. Parasites, likely internal and external. He's been suffering a long time." Scott swallowed hard. "Can he make it?" "He shouldn't be standing," she answered honestly. "That alone tells me he's a fighter. So yes, if we work fast." She slipped the 4-needle in. Champ didn't flinch. Half an hour later, while the clinic hummed with activity, Scott leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly, staring at the horse that had appeared from the desert like a ghost. A horse that shouldn't still be alive. Dr. Ramos finally stepped away from the operating table and pulled off her gloves. "You the owner?" she asked. Scott hesitated. "I don't know. He showed up on my land. No brand. No markings." "Then for now," she said, "he's yours." Those words hit Scott harder than he expected. Yours. He'd never owned anything this fragile, or this valuable. Then came the part he'd been dreading. "It's going to take weeks of treatment. Specialized feed. Deworming. Medications. Farrier work. The wound care alone will cost hundreds." She took a breath, then added, "You're looking at somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. Scott didn't have $20, let alone $2,000. "I can work it off," he blurted. "I know horses. I know ranch work. Whatever you need." Dr. Ramos studied him for a moment, seeing the mix of desperation and determination written across his face. Then she nodded slowly. "My assistant quit last month. If you show up on time, work hard, and take responsibility for this stallion, we'll work something out." Relief hit Scott so fast he nearly swayed. "Thank you," he whispered. "And Scott," she added, "you didn't just save a stray. This horse, he's something special." She didn't explain what she meant, and Scott didn't ask. But he felt it too. Something about Champ defied logic. As if the desert had been holding on to him for years, waiting for the right set of hands to appear. The following days formed a rhythm Scott had never experienced before. Mornings began with cleaning kennels, afternoons assisting Dr. Ramos with exams, evenings spent in Champ's stall brushing out the dirt, trimming tangled hair, whispering encouragements as the horse slowly regained strength. He learned Champ's subtle signals, a twitch of the ear when he was uncomfortable, a quiet rumble when he was hungry, the slight shift in posture that told Scott he trusted him. Every day, Champ looked a little less like a ghost and a little more like the horse he'd once been. And every day, the mystery deepened. Hidden under layers of grime, scars appeared, old scars. Circular, rope burn-like. Marks that didn't come from a simple accident. Someone had worked this horse hard. Someone had used him. Someone had hurt him. One afternoon, Dr. Ramos brushed back Champ's forelock and frowned. "He's purebred stock," she said quietly. "Look at the bone structure. The teeth. The angle of the shoulder. This horse wasn't backyard bred. Someone invested in him. Then why abandon him in the desert?" She didn't answer. But her silence said everything, no good reason. Scott made calls to ranches across the region asking if anyone had lost a stallion. Each call ended the same way, confusion, dismissal, even irritation. But something else too. When he mentioned where he'd found the horse, folks went quiet. The Russell property. People didn't like talking about that place. Finally, he called his old boss, Gary. There was a long pause. Then Gary exhaled. "Scott, that's impossible." "What is?" "No horse has been on that land in over 30 years. I'm telling you, Gary, I found him right there." "Describe him." Scott did. Every detail. When he finished, Gary whispered, "Dear God." "Scott, that sounds like Victory's champion." Scott frowned. "Who?" "Champ," Gary said. "The real Champ. Russell's prized colt. They thought he died 15 years ago." The air went still. Gary explained the story, how Douglas Russell had been one of the finest breeders in Oregon before a stroke left his irresponsible son, Roger, in charge. How Roger had run the operation into the ground, selling horses illegally, trying to cover gambling debts. How 5 registered horses, including young Champ, vanished without paperwork. "People assumed Roger sold them off quietly," Gary said. "Off the books. Without documentation. Some believed they ended up in kill pens." Scott felt sick. "So how did Champ end up on my land?" "That's what worries me," Gary replied. "If Roger still has connections, he might not be happy to hear someone found that horse alive." Scott ended the call with a pit in his stomach. That night he stayed late at the clinic, leaning on the stall door while Champ ate. "What happened to you, boy?" he whispered. Champ lifted his head, strands of hay hanging from his lips, and nudged Scott's shoulder gently. As if to say, "It doesn't matter. I'm here now." But someone else knew he was here too. 3 days later, the clinic door swung open. A man wearing expensive boots and a spotless hat stepped inside. His face was red with anger or sun, or something darker. "You Scott Jones?" he barked. Scott turned. "Yes." The man smirked coldly. "I'm Roger Russell." The room seemed to tighten around them. "I hear you have something that belongs to me," Roger said. "A bay stallion." Scott felt his pulse steady into something solid. "I found a dying horse on my property," he said calmly. "And I saved him." Roger's smile sharpened. "Then you saved my investment." In that moment Scott understood, this wasn't over. Saving Champ had been the easy part. Keeping him would be the real fight. When Roger Russell walked into the Burns Veterinary Clinic, every instinct in Scott's body told him to brace. The man carried a presence that wasn't loud, but heavy. Like a storm front. Roger didn't bother with greetings or politeness. He walked straight toward Scott with the confidence of someone who had bullied his way through life and expected that momentum to carry him forever. "You have my horse," he said. Scott didn't step back. "I found a horse. One that was dying. No brand. No papers. No proof he belonged to anyone." Roger leaned in, his voice low, hot with anger. That stallion is worth $50,000. He's from my father's bloodline. Anything on that land belongs to the Russell estate. Your father died in 2009, Scott replied evenly. The land was sold for back taxes. It's mine. The clinic fell silent. Even the animals seemed to sense the tension. Then Dr. Ramos stepped in, planting herself between the two men. Mr. Russell, she said, this horse arrived here dehydrated, starved, and severely neglected. If you want to claim ownership, you'll need proof. Which you don't have. Roger's jaw tightened. I'll have the sheriff here in 10 minutes. You do that, she said calmly. He stormed out, boots striking the floor sharply. Outside, Scott watched him make a call, pacing like a man used to snapping his fingers and watching the world rearrange itself to his liking. But the world was shifting in ways Roger didn't expect. Within the hour, a sheriff's deputy arrived with a woman in a tailored suit who introduced herself as Roger's attorney. She carried a leather folio and an expression that suggested she'd practiced intimidating people in mirrors. The deputy held up both hands. Let's keep this civil. The horse stays at the clinic until a judge sorts this out. Nobody removes him. Roger sputtered with outrage. He's mine. Then provide documentation, the deputy said. He didn't have any. That fact alone cracked the first piece of Roger's armor. But the legal battle had only begun. That night, Scott slept in his truck outside the clinic. He couldn't leave Champ vulnerable. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the stars, feeling the weight of what was coming. He was a broke ranch hand. Roger was a man with money, connections, and a history of bending the truth until it served him. But Scott also had something Roger didn't, the truth. And a horse whose survival told a story no paperwork could hide. The next morning, Scott met with a legal aid attorney named Diana Finch. She was young but sharp, with an intensity that reminded him of a coiled rope ready to snap forward. She went through the situation piece by piece. No brand, no registration, no legal claim, she said. If he belonged to your land, and you found him unowned, he's yours. But Roger won't stop, Scott said. No, she agreed. Because that horse is evidence. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the table. I've heard rumors about Roger Russell for years. Illegal sales. Off-the-record breeding. Horses disappearing. If Champ is who you think he is, he connects Roger to crimes that span more than a decade. Scott felt the room tilt slightly. Crimes? Oh yes, she said. And if you're willing to fight, I'll take this case pro bono. Fight. The word settled into Scott's chest, warm and heavy. He nodded. I'm in. Diana smiled faintly. Good. Then we start digging. And dig they did. Scott went through county property records, auction documents, livestock sales, anything with the Russell name on it. Diana called former employees and subpoenaed state agricultural paperwork. Dr. Ramos reached out to vets across Oregon and Nevada. Piece by piece, a picture formed. Years ago, when Douglas Russell became ill, Roger took control of the ranch and the valuable breeding stock. Instead of paying debts and selling horses legally, he'd sold them under the table to avoid state oversight. Horses vanished from paperwork. Registered bloodlines disappeared. And 5 stallions in Mares, including Victory's champion, never appeared in any legal transaction. One former employee told Scott. Roger loaded horses onto trailers in the middle of the night. Never saw them again. Another said. He'd sell stallions to a breeding outfit in Nevada. No questions asked? A third said. Champ was special. Douglas had big plans for him. Roger, not so much. Then a breakthrough came from a vet in Nevada. I treated a bay stallion about 3 months ago, the vet said over the phone. Deep scars, malnutrition, clear signs of overuse. The place was a breeding mill, unregistered Mares, undocumented stallions, foals sold to whoever had cash. And guess who financed that facility? Scott already knew the answer. Roger Russell. That was the missing link. Champ hadn't lived in the desert for 15 years. He'd been used for illegal breeding, discarded the moment he became a liability. And when the Nevada facility came under scrutiny, they dumped him in the desert to die. But he didn't die. Somehow, Champ made his way back across state lines to the only land that had ever been his home. By the time the preliminary hearing began, the evidence stacked against Roger was damning. The Harney County Courthouse was a modest brick building with a small courtroom that felt too quiet, too intimate for the storm brewing inside. Residents packed the benches, ranchers, former employees, curious locals. Word had spread. People knew what Roger was. They just hadn't had proof. Until now. Judge Holloway, a silver-haired man known for fairness and bluntness, presided. Diana presented the case with precision and fire, breeding records, auction inconsistencies, testimony from Nevada, and photos of Champ's condition when Scott found him. "This horse wasn't cared for," she said firmly. "He was used. Abandoned. Left to die. Mr. Jones saved his life. And now Mr. Russell wants to claim him because the truth threatens him." Roger's attorney objected repeatedly. Holloway overruled each objection with growing impatience. When Roger testified, he crumbled faster than anyone expected. He claimed Champ escaped. He claimed paperwork burned in a fire. He claimed employees lied out of spite. But Holloway cut through it. "Mr. Russell," the judge said, "produce one document, just one, that proves you legally owned this horse at any point." Roger's silence filled the room. Holloway leaned back, exhaled, and spoke the words that changed everything. "Based on the evidence, the horse known as Victory's Champion belongs legally to Mr. Scott Jones. Additionally, I am referring this case to the district attorney for investigation into potential animal cruelty and illegal livestock sales." A whisper ran through the courtroom like wind through tall grass. Roger's face drained of color. His attorney leaned in urgently, but it was too late. The hammer had fallen. As the room emptied, Diana shook Scott's hand. "It's over. Champ's yours." But for Scott, it wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't even victory. It was gratitude. Champ wasn't just a horse. He was a survivor who had fought his way back from the brink. And now, both of them had a second chance. But as Scott walked out of the courthouse, something else took shape in his mind. A realization that the hardest part wasn't claiming Champ. It was figuring out how to build a life worthy of him. And that journey was only just beginning. Scott had won the court case, but the victory didn't come with a road map. Owning Champ was both a blessing and a responsibility that weighed on him from the moment Judge Holloway struck the gavel. The stallion was valuable, undeniably. But value didn't feed a horse. Value didn't build fences. Value didn't conjure water from barren desert soil. Scott's land? It was still 240 acres of rugged, empty high desert. A place with no barn, no pasture, no water. A place people warned him would swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. But Scott had something now he hadn't had before. Two things, actually. Champ. And purpose. The day after the ruling, as Scott stood outside the courthouse, his phone buzzed. It was Gary, his former boss. The man didn't say hello. "Scott," he said, "I've been thinking." That sentence alone told Scott something important was coming. "You ever wonder," Gary continued, "why folks call that land of yours worthless?" Scott shrugged even though Gary couldn't see it. "Because it's dry. Empty. Dead." "Not dead," Gary corrected. "Untapped." Scott frowned. "What do you mean?" Gary cleared his throat. "I've been studying water rights in that area for years. That valley of yours sits on top of an aquifer. A deep one. The county never drilled because they didn't think anyone would farm or ranch that land again. But it's there." Scott nearly dropped the phone. Water meant life. Water meant fencing. Water meant pasture, crops, animals, hope. "Drilling a well costs money," Scott said quietly. "That's where Champ comes in," Gary replied. "A breeding stallion with his bloodlines? He's worth more in stud fees than most ranchers make in a year. I want to propose something." Scott braced. Partnerships always came with strings. But Gary wasn't a man who'd ever treated him poorly. "You let me board a few maras on your land," Gary said. "We split breeding income 50-50. I'll finance the well drilling, help build infrastructure, and bring manpower. We build this ranch together." The air left Scott's lungs. "You'd do that?" he whispered. "You've got something special," Gary said. "That horse didn't come back from the dead just to sit in a barn. He's foundation stock. And your land, it's got potential. I think together we can make something real out there. Something big." Scott didn't need time to think. He didn't have doubt. He simply said, "I'm in." Within a week, the well drilling crew arrived. Scott stood in the dust watching their machinery roar to life. The early winter wind whipped across the valley, carrying sand and promise alike. The men drilled deep into the earth. Day after day, the sound of machinery echoed off the volcanic ridges. On the sixth day, the drill hit water. A burst of pressure shot upward, spraying out cold, clear liquid that shimmered under the pale morning sun. The workers cheered. Scott didn't cheer. He just stood still, throat tight, staring at the water spilling across land no one believed in. Champ stood nearby in a temporary corral, head high, watching the scene unfold with something almost regal in his posture. Almost as if he knew this land, his land, was waking up again. With water secured, everything moved fast. Fencing crews mapped out pastures. Lumber trucks hauled in materials. Gary's men erected a modest but sturdy barn. Scott worked sunrise to sunset, sweating through shirts, hauling posts, swinging hammers, learning carpentry one mistake at a time. He'd never been so exhausted. He'd never slept so deeply. He'd never felt more alive. At night, he'd sit outside Champ's corral, brushing the stallion's coat until it gleamed like polished chestnut under the moonlight. The horse leaned into the brush strokes, peaceful, trusting. There was a bond between them now, one built from survival, not convenience. "You saved yourself," Scott would whisper sometimes. "I just got lucky enough to be there." By early spring, the ranch began to resemble something real. Grass sprouted in irrigated pastures. The barn stood proudly at the valley's center. A modest cabin was under construction, and would soon replace the truck Scott still slept in. And Champ? He was thriving. Word spread fast across the region. Victory's champion was alive. A stallion from one of the finest bloodlines Oregon had ever seen. A horse everyone had believed lost. Ranchers who had once dismissed Scott now showed up at his property asking about breeding contracts. Dr. Ramos visited often, partly to check on Champ and partly because she was quietly astonished at what Scott and Gary had built in such a short time. One morning, she stood with Scott near the fence line, watching Champ trot gracefully across the pasture. "He's strong," she said, arms crossed. "Stronger than he has any right to be after what he went through." "He's stubborn," Scott replied with a faint smile. "That too," she agreed. She stepped closer to him. "You know what I find remarkable? He walked miles across the desert in critical condition and found you. Of all people. Of all places." Scott glanced at her. "You think it means something?" "I know it does," she said simply. As breeding season approached, contracts poured in. The first foals from Champ's pairings drew interest across the state. Ranchers wanted his traits, his intelligence, his strength, his calm temperament. Champ was no longer a lost stallion. He was the foundation of a new bloodline. And Scott? He was no longer a broke ranch hand drifting from job to job. He was becoming something he'd never expected. A rancher. A breeder. A man with land and future and purpose. But perhaps the most meaningful change wasn't physical or financial. It was in Scott himself. The desert had stripped him down to nothing. It had taken him to the edges of isolation and hopelessness. And then, through the most unlikely of messengers, it gave something back. A chance. Years passed. The ranch grew. Pastures expanded. A larger barn went up. Then a second. Scott built a home on the ridge overlooking the valley, close to the place where Champ had first emerged from the shadows of dawn. He married. He had children who learned to walk in the same desert soil he once believed worthless. They rode ponies raised from Champ's bloodline. They grew up listening to the story of the starving horse who changed everything. Champ lived to the age of 32, a remarkable life for any horse, let alone one who had endured such brutality. His final years were spent in comfort, grazing in wide pastures, watching sunsets with a calm dignity that made him seem ancient and wise. When he passed, Scott buried him on the highest ridge overlooking the ranch. The sandstone headstone read, "Victory's champion, called Champ. He survived everything. And saved us all." People came from across Oregon for the small memorial. Ranchers, veterinarians, neighbors, even folks who had only ever heard the story through whispers. They stood quietly as Scott placed one hand on the headstone. "This ranch started with him," Scott said softly. "And everything it became, came from a horse nobody wanted." The wind swept softly across the ridge. Sagebrush rustled. And for a moment, the desert felt less empty than ever before. Scott's $25 gamble had turned into something extraordinary. Not because of luck. Not because of money. But because he refused to walk away from something broken. Because he saw worth where others saw waste. Because he believed that every living thing deserved a chance. And in return, the desert gave him a legacy. A ranch built on compassion, courage, and one stallion who found his way home against every odd. If you ever find yourself in the high desert near Harney County and look out across the land at dawn, you might swear you see a dark bay stallion standing on the ridge. Head high. Mane blowing in the cold wind. Watching over the place he saved. And the man who saved him.